Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for a follow-up and a post-mortem to the rebuild of this 499 New Haven EP-5 from 1956 and 1957. Even though I said I wasn't going to do a post-mortem and probably would not do a railhead test, I went ahead and did both. And I want to follow up now with some additional information and make a request of you. First, let's quickly retrace the steps. I've been operating this locomotive on the layout at scale speed, pulling 4 common streamlined passenger coaches. I noticed 2 things. One, it was emanating an odor that smelled like oil heating or grease heating. Now this was not difficult to notice. All you had to be was just relatively close to the track, maybe even as close as kind of the relationship of this camera to the railhead, and you could smell it very easily. None of my other Alco or GP7s had ever emanated that type of smell. The other thing I did is I pulled it off the tracks, and I noticed simply by touching the motor like this with my thumb that it was extremely hot. You could not leave your thumb there more than a second or two. It was that hot. It was very uncomfortable, and I think it would have burned skin had I left it there. So those were the symptoms. And then I rebuilt it trying to address those symptoms. I rebuilt, totally disassembled the front and only motor. I checked all lubrications, re-lubricated, checked all fittings, checked for friction points. I even replaced the thrust plates, and I invite you to go back to that video to see all that detail, because I noticed that the thrust plates not only had dimples, one had a clean hole in it, which might have allowed the end of the armature, the point on the armature, to touch the motor, touch the motor box itself. And I simply wanted to re-lubricate, clean, thoroughly clean, and rebuild. The next thing I did was to operate the Santa Fe in the background, the 470. Now it pulled 1 additional car. It's a 2-motor locomotive, as you know, and it pulled 1 additional car. It pulled the dummy A unit and the 4 streamlined coaches. I operated it for about 18 minutes. Turned it over and noticed that both motors produced enough heat that I could feel it just a little bit through the shell on the top. But when I turned it over and touched the base of the motor, that it was noticeably warm. Now I could leave my thumb on both, but it was uncomfortable, but I didn't think I was going to get burned. Whereas when I touched the base of the the EP-5, I felt like I was going to get burned. So that was step number 1. So that re-emphasized that these Alcos or GP7s or EP-5s or these motor configurations do produce heat. The EP-5 499 having been rebuilt, I conducted the same experiment, except it only pulled 4 passenger coaches without a dummy A unit. And of course it only has a single motor, not a dual motor. And I ran it for about 18 minutes. I noticed 2 things. One is that there was no more smell of the heating oil or grease. Now this is a smell that was not hard to detect. You could be within a foot of the layout as the train passed, and you could smell it. You could tell that there was some sort of element heating up. When I re-ran it, I noticed that that was eliminated. I did not smell it any longer. As a matter of fact, I stopped it real quickly and put my nose right down on the front of the cab, and I couldn't detect that particular odor any longer. However, after running 18 minutes, I turned it over again, held my thumb on the bottom of the motor, and it was very warm, but it was not so uncomfortable that I couldn't keep my thumb there. It was not a lot of fun, but I didn't think I was going to get burned because it was just very warm, bordering on hot, but I think the heat had been reduced just a little bit. So that's kind of the timeline and the events of what occurred. Noticing the odor and the heat, rebuilding it, comparing it to a run of the Santa Fe, and then running it 1 more time at scale speed for about 18 minutes, and then a very unscientific way of measuring the heat. What I'd like to ask going forward is that you would place some comments below so that all can see and all can have a conversation, group conversation or a community conversation about these types of diesel motors that commonly appear, of course, in the EP-5s, the Alcos, and the GP7s, and maybe others that I just forgot about your experiences with their heat production, their odor, producing any type of burned or heating type odor, and then maybe your skills and experience with rebuilding these motors, your skills, experience, and knowledge of lubricants, and even friction point. A colleague and friend of mine who also collects, operates, and builds American Flyer trains has an infrared camera, and we're going to see if running one of this particular locomotive without the shell, we're going to see if we can measure or see the hot spots, the hottest portions of the motor gear assembly, and possibly give us some sort of thermal image, thermal profile through images as it heats up, recording each of these photographs to see if we can see where that heat is starting, originates from, whether it be the gearbox or a single friction point, whatever. And through that, we might be able to pinpoint that localized heating, because what we want to do is we want to take these images as it heats up prior to it reaching a steady state. In other words, kind of its maximum heat, where what it's producing is losing part of it, and then it's simply replacing that at that particular temperature, and it holds that temperature. We want to do that before that occurs, before it reaches steady state, and take these images to see if we can pinpoint what is the root of the heat. Now, the one thing I noticed in running this train again the second time was that this truck right here was not exactly cold. Now, it was not the same level of heat as the motor truck, but it had produced some sort of heat. I don't think that it could be, I don't think it was the electrical flow. So this one has limited friction points, which is basically the axles going through that little shell that has the holes in it that serve as the bushings for the axles. The wheels rolling over the rail, the slide contact or shoe contact is a friction point, and then of course the axles and their bushings. So it would be interesting to see what the heat source is for these as well. So again, leave a comment below about your knowledge and experience of the heat being produced in these diesel locomotives and its possible best lubrication. Thanks again for watching Dave's American Flyer Trains. So long, everyone.